Well, good morning, everyone. Well, well, thank you all for staying around for the forum, and I am honored that your new vicar invited me to be the first speaker for your forum um, on who is my neighbor. And so I think I'll wait like a minute or two to let folks come and bring their chairs up if they're coming up. And a couple logistical things. If you have a question, the microphone here is a good way for you to be able to come ask your question that the folks that are joining online can also hear your question. While I suspect that they probably have some of the same questions as well once we get to that point. So, who is my neighbor? So, this is a question I think that has plagued Christianity from its very beginning. There's this wonderful interchange between Jesus and a lawyer in Luke's gospel. And the thing is, we don't often think of that lawyer and the interchange between Jesus and about the question about a neighbor, about who is my neighbor. But that question actually started a very well known story that most of us are probably familiar with. So this lawyer comes up to Jesus and he says to him, "So, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus, in his wisdom, says to him, "Well, what does it say in Scripture?" And he says, "To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself." And the guy says back to Jesus, "Well, that's fine, well and good. I do all of that." But being a good lawyer, he wasn't satisfied with that answer. No offense to any lawyers that are here. He wasn't satisfied with the answer that he got. So he says to Jesus, "So then I get the whole love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, but who's my neighbor?" There's the question. Who is my neighbor? Well, Jesus, instead of saying to him, "Well, your neighbor is XYZ," Jesus tells him a parable. And I love how Jesus never really answers the question directly, but just tells you, you can figure this out on your own. So he said, there was a man going from Jericho to Jerusalem, right? So I want you to remember those two pieces because that's important in this story. We often hear this story, but we miss the details. So why is he going between these two cities? Jerusalem was the capital where all the people gathered for the temple and all the stuff happened there. But Jericho was where the 1% of the 1% lived. Jericho was the hoity-toity neighborhood. Jericho was the really rich neighborhood. And you remember Jericho because of a guy named Bartimaeus who was blind and Jesus healed him later. So Jericho is this very rich and affluent place. Herod, the king, has his summer palace in Jericho. So these are not poor people. These are the well-to-do. So this guy is going between these two cities and he falls among thieves. So you can imagine why he fell among thieves. He's probably carrying a whole bunch of money and rings and jewelry and all this stuff. So he's coming from this city and he falls among thieves and he's on the side of the street. And along comes a priest and looks at him and crosses on the other side. Here comes another person who is supposed to be an upstanding religious leader, looks at him and goes, "Yeah, not my problem," keeps moving. And then the gospel parable that Jesus tells us says, a Samaritan. So why a Samaritan? So here's the thing about Samaritans. According to Jewish law, Samaritans are unclean. They are the worst of the worst, a little bit lower than Greeks. So you have these people that are despised, literally despised by the people in Jesus' culture. The Samaritan, the outsider, the person who is the Taliban of our time, Al Qaeda, pick one of those. This is who Jesus said. This guy goes and picks the guy out of the ditch. He bandages him. He pours oil on his wounds. He takes him to the closest hospital. And get this, he pays the hospital bill. Now, in our current time, if someone fell among thieves and unconscious next to the road and you take them to the hospital, I guarantee you the bill is not $20. This guy, this guy who is supposed to be despised, shells out 60, $70,000 and says, when you're done with all of his surgeries and all this other stuff and there's other medical expenses, I will pay for all of it. Now, you can imagine the lawyer hearing this parable is sitting there scratching his head and thinking, well, what? Huh? That's a theological term. um, Jesus looks at him and says, so, who was the neighbor in this parable? And you know that the lawyer is squirming. You know the people who are hearing this parable are squirming because they know Samaritans are the outcasts. And it takes everything in him to say, the one who showed mercy. Now, he didn't say the one who was neighborly. He didn't say the one who managed to help and pick up the guy and take him to the hospital. He said the one who showed mercy. And Jesus says to him, well, go and do likewise. And I almost imagine that lawyer is running off going, well, I'm not talking to Jesus anymore because he gives us these impossible things to do. So who is our neighbor? Our neighbors are the people that we walk in compassion with. Our neighbors are the people who we would not necessarily call a neighbor. Jesus expands the definition of neighbor to be so broad that it means that there's no one outside the realm of God's grace that we are not called to minister to and with. And I can safely say that that is a really hard thing for us to do sometimes, especially with people that we don't like. I'm always reminded that Jesus said to his disciples and to us that you are called to love your Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And we forget that as yourself part. Because to love somebody else, to be a good neighbor, means you have to be able to love yourself well enough to feel like you can be a neighbor to the other person. The Samaritan was secure enough and well enough in who he was, in the compassion that he knew that he had, the mercy that he was able to share, that he could be a good neighbor. He wasn't held back by all the baggage of the other stuff of his own self-worth. And I think we are called to do the same. We are called to be those people who walk compassion with each other, even the people that you don't disagree with. When I was growing up, my grandmother often would say to my brother and I, you are a beloved child of God, act like it. But then she would add, and it means that you have to treat other people like they're beloved children of God too. So the question for us may not necessarily be about who is my neighbor, but who is that neighbor that I find hard to love, that I need to love? Who is that person that I may think is outside the realm of God's possibility, outside the realm of God's grace, that I need to encounter, that I need to show grace and mercy to? I think the root of that is what we call the Christian journey. That is who we are distilled, the people who walk in mercy and compassion with others along this journey. And so before I end up giving a second sermon, I'm going to stop there. And see if there are any questions or comments or anything that you would like to share. I was that clear. Wow. That doesn't happen very often. But questions or comments that you might have. Yep.
Especially around the time of the election, but it lingers on. I found it really hard literally to love some of my neighbors, people that I've lived in the same neighborhood with for 20 years, who I do care about and love. But we all had our various flags and signs out.
Yeah.
And there was a palpable tension. And I'm not sure we've recovered from that on my street. And I know I haven't recovered in my heart.
Yeah.
So,
well,
do you have any tips?
Easy questions apparently. I think part of the challenge of our recent election and trying to love our neighbor is being able to see our neighbor. I think that that's the first That's the first step in kind of recognizing our neighbor, being able to see them. While we may disagree politically or on partisan issues and stuff like that, what I have found in my own life and ministry is that when I find something that is connected for both of us, that we can find things that we have more in common than we have that are different. Like for instance, I mean, last week, earlier this week, I went to the Basilical Church of in St. Louis with the new Archbishop Rosansky. Um, I was told that that's the first time that the two bishops actually ever got together. And that was kind of at my initiating because I really wanted to kind of figure out where we can work together on some things, even though theologically we are on like completely different spectrums in many ways. um, but I think that being a good neighbor means that we have to step outside of the bubbles and the comfort zones that we have and find the places that we can connect to somebody else and connect to their journey. And you can set some good rules to say, you know what, we're not going to discuss politics. We're not going to discuss this, but we can talk about XYZ. Or if we're going to talk about politics, if we're going to talk about partisan issues, that we're going to set some ground rules so you know what, that we can listen to each other, because I am convinced that we talk at each other, not to each other. We stop talking we stop having conversation to understand the other person, and instead we move the conversation to try to give your opinion to the other person. So before you even finish speaking, the other person is ready to jump in on a point that you said, and that's not a conversation. That's not even a debate. That's just kind of just talking at each other. And so I think part of the challenge in these times is finding a place that you can talk to one another as neighbors from God. So hopefully that's helpful and practical. So any others?
This is not a question. This is something that happened to me approximately, I guess it was about this time, not last year, but the year before. I was working in a yard down in South County. My son and I flip houses.
Ah.
Man pulled up in a big four-wheel drive pickup. He could have been your brother, except he was about 4 inches taller than you. And
well, with the hat on, I usually am.
Yeah, and outweighed you by probably about 60 pounds. He was a piece of a man. He walked up to me as I was raking and working in the yard, and introduced himself, and I introduced myself. He said, "I'm here to pick up some furniture from this lady." And the lady was next door, and they had sold the house next door. He was picking it up to donate to his church, as they had a church, I believe it was up in North County someplace. And then he proceeded to tell me about that his son would have been with him, but he wasn't there with him at that time. And when he said this, he started choking up. Well, I didn't pursue the question or wanted to see what was happening. And he talked about that he taught boxing at his church. He was real active within the church. And then about that time, the lady pulled up and he said, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you anymore." But he left something in my mind when he said, "My son would have normally been with me to help me." Well, as he was taking furniture out and putting it in the truck, just to give you an idea of what kind of man he was, he picked up one of these overstuffed chairs, and I was going to get the tailgate for him, but he walked out with this chair in his hand, and he lifted it over the side of the truck and put it in the side of the truck. Curiosity got the better of me, and after he came out with that, he got in the truck and started making some notes, and I walked up and I tapped on the window, and I said, "If you don't mind, out of curiosity, I noticed when you started talking about your son, you choked up." And he said, "Oh, I don't mind." He said, and he started tearing, and I said, "If you don't mind me asking, what happened to your son?" And I fully expected him to say, this is stereotypic, that he overdosed or something like that. He said, "No, he was playing a game of basketball with some friends of his in the street."
Yeah.
And they got into an argument, a discussion. The one kid went inside, got a gun, and came out and shot and killed him. So I impart this because this has stayed with me for years now. And I always think of him because I wish I could touch out to him and reach out to him, but I think and hope I did by just asking him. And he said his son would have been 16 if he was still alive and helping him.
I think you
Just
showed mercy.
Impart that to you.
And I would add some compassion as well, just being able to hear somebody else's story. So I think in that instance, you were really being a very good neighbor. Sometimes that's all that's needed. Thank you. So any other questions before we draw to a conclusion? Another easy question.
Well, I think so often we maybe ingrained in our head is the idea that we reach out to our neighbor because we want them to come to our church and to grow our church and to have a bigger budget and to be stronger and bigger. So can you talk about how reaching out to our neighbor ties to church growth or what it means for the church?
Yeah.
It's not an A-B correlation, I don't think.
Nope.
Thanks.
So the word that we use, and you whisper this in dark circles in the Episcopal Church, is evangelism. And most of the time we think of it as that person that knocks on your door and asks you, have you found Jesus? And I'm usually the one who will say, I didn't know he was missing. Or did he look behind the couch, or who knows? But that's not evangelism. Or the people who will come up to you sometimes and say, are you going to spend your eternity in smoking or non-smoking? Those really bad jokes. I call that spiritual bullying, because nobody's ever converted by someone threatening them about where you're going to go spend your eternity. Evangelism at its best is telling your story, hearing other people's story, and inviting them into this wider story. So, when you go out into the community and you do good works or something like that, or you do like a food bank, or you do Habitat for Humanity, you're not doing that to get people to come to church. You're doing that because you're showing compassion and mercy, and you're being a companion with. The problem I think most of the time that we've had with evangelism is that we think we're going in to save other people, or that we're going in to do it for them. See, you say evangelism in the church and things start falling apart. We had this notion that we are going someplace to give people something. In my experience, whenever I have gone on a mission trip or I've gone and done something, I get more out of it than I think that I give to the people who are there. And so evangelism at its core is being a companion with someone else. And once you invite them into your story, know that both of you end up being changed. What I've been saying across the diocese is that I don't want churches who are welcoming anymore. Welcoming is not what we don't need to be welcoming. Here's why I say that. Welcoming says that you come to my church and conform to how I do things. Right? Or better yet, here's a question. Name a church that you've ever been to that said that they were unwelcoming. Even the most closed-off, closed-minded evangelical fundamentalist church will say they are welcoming. So I don't want churches that are welcoming. I want our communities of faith across this diocese to be places of hospitality. Hospitality is very different than welcome, because hospitality says, bring all of your story, bring your brokenness and your wholeness, bring all of you, and together we are going to be changed, all of us. At its best, that is evangelism. It's hearing somebody else's story, validating that story, and framing it in the story of who we are as followers of Jesus. If they come to church, wonderful, that's great. If they don't, they still encountered God's hospitality in you. My Easter sermon was that, sometimes the only resurrection story that people are going to read is you. The only gospel that some people are going to pick up and read is you. The only Bible that people are going to meet sometimes is you. Make those interactions, those stories, those connection points matter. Make them count. Because sometimes the only Christian that they will experience is you. So at its best, that is what our that's what evangelism looks like, and that is what inviting people to come to be a part of St. Francis or to be a part of the church is about. Jesus did not say go find a bunch of Episcopalians. He said go make disciples. And as they said, disciples are followers. So go make disciples, don't go make St. Franciscans, I guess. So, well, thank you. I think that was a great question, Lori.
It seems that the Spirit is telling us that this is, we're wrapping
Up. Okay.
because your battery pack is flashing on.
Oh.
We're running out of batteries, so
That's a good way to get the bishop to stop talking.
I gave you half-loaded ones.
If you want the bishop to be short, give him a microphone with half-dead batteries. Perfect. Well, thank you all so very much for staying. Thank you for those who are joining online. This was a joy, and I think I will be I'll be keeping "We Are Honking in the Light of Christ" in my mind for a long time.
Bishop Deon, on behalf of my parish.
Yay!
People of St. Francis, we just thank you so much for being here today, for being such a good sport in the wind and the honking and the battery pack and the whole 9 yards. So thank you.
Thank you. As they say, you grow where you're planted. Well, thank you all, and I wish you all the best, continued blessings and grace as you embark on this new journey together. So thank you for being here, and thank you for having me.